Welcome to Rocking Our Prayers. Now, my guest today is Aaron Rock Sr. He's a fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School's Middle East Initiative, and he's published two fantastic books, Practicing Islam, Egypt's Islamic Revival, and In the Shade of the Sunna, Salafi Piety in the 20th-Century Middle East. Now, Aaron is truly brilliant. What I love about his work is he connects both the macro and the micro by examining structural shifts in communications and education, urbanisation, as well as Islamic print media. So I'm really honoured and delighted that he's joined with me today to discuss a sort of counter-mobilisation to modernisation. Aaron, welcome.
Alice, thanks so much for having me, and thank you for reading both of the books. I don't think there are that many people outside my family who can lay claim to that.
No, that is false modesty. False modesty. These are fantastic and everyone should read them. I really mean that. They're brilliant. They really, really help me. Okay, so first question. How did colonialism change religiosity and religious practices in Egypt?
So this is one of the hardest questions to when it comes to understanding the broader story of religion and colonialism, because there are developments we have that we associate with colonialism, which are actually related to modernization that we can see in contexts that are not colonial. And then there are others that are distinctly colonial. So we think of first in terms of modernization in Egypt. We know from Tim Mitchell's work that colonialism in Egypt initiates new ways of organizing and spatially structuring Egypt, as well as the related emergence of a distinct space for learning, a new relationship to the written word, and so forth.
Could you just clarify what that means? Like, what
So,
do those
for
terms
example,
mean?
you have society is not organized in straight lines prior to French colonial influence, and it comes to be organized in straight lines. The idea that learning takes place only in a single defined space rather than in a variety of spaces is
What's another
something
example of a straight line, just so I'm clear on that?
So, for example, organizing people in a crowd in a recognizable order. I mean, if we think about from a broader global perspective, we think about James Scott's book, Seeing like a State in Lines. And this effort to essentially organize in a way that it can easily be mapped. This is something we see coming in 19th century Egypt, which first has French colonialism in the early 19th century and then in the late 19th century British colonialism. But where it gets problematic to attribute this to colonialism, though, is that we see many of the same developments happening in Yemen during this period, which is not under colonial rule, and which was never colonized and is modernizing at this time. Its closest connection, if anything, is the Ottoman Empire, of course. We also see a linkage of allegiance and visible identity in the 19th century, which again, we often attribute to colonialism. It's something that is very much present in Ottoman Egypt. We see people's dress, whether in the context of the army or in the context of schools, coming to be associated with allegiance to and membership in those specific institutions. But this isn't something that's reducible to colonialism. This is much more of a broader story of the development of state power, the growing regulation of individual bodies by the state, and the administrative structure that allows them to do that. And finally, we might note the emergence of something called that describes as the politics of the self that we see in British colonial rule over Egypt in the late 19th century. This idea that an individual is responsible for disciplining themselves, and that if they don't regulating their own, then they can pose a threat to the broader social whole. So all of these 19th century developments have real implications for religiosity and religious practice in Egypt, but they're just not reducible to colonialism, even if we can say they're adjacent to or linked to it. And even the last of these, this idea of the politics of the self, it's the most obviously colonial practice, but there's a sense in which, much like nationalism, it's modular, that there's a distinctly modern logic to it, but it can be applied to vastly differing ends. So this brings us to early 20th century Egypt. Say, in some sense, the key shift here for religiosity and religious practice, not only within, but also beyond Egypt, is the fall of the Ottoman Empire. And this isn't simply a question of geopolitics, though that's obviously part of the story, but also one that stimulates the rise of a variety of Islamic reformist thinkers and movements, namely, what do you do in the absence of a state that can reasonably claim Islamic leadership and authority? That even for folks who might have scoffed at the authority of the Ottoman Caliphate, the fall of that caliphate raises serious questions. And finally, I think
Wait, why do you think that was important? Why do you think that was important?
I think the conceptual issue posed by the fall of Ottoman rule is that there's no longer even a veneer of a state that applies the Sharia in much of the Middle East. Much of the Middle East is effectively independent of the Ottoman Empire during this period, but still you have this veneer of Ottoman rule. And there's no longer even a claim you can make, oh, yeah, still have the caliphate in Istanbul, even if it's not perfect. And this stimulates the rise of Islamic movements, which are essentially trying to work horizontally to deal with some of the questions posed by the fall of Ottoman rule. The questions of essentially forming a sustainable Islamic worldview that can react to the changing political, economic, and social conditions. Now, to come to your related question about religious law and colonial rule and the introduction of secular reforms and family law, I think there's actually a good argument that the current focus on family law as it pertains to the Sharia is an outgrowth of colonial rule. And this makes good sense, right? Because when an opponent attacks a certain space or group, there's an effect of rallying around it and often inflating its importance. And by attack, I don't mean necessarily seeking to reform family law. I mean the convulsion, the cultural and social convulsions of colonial rule make it so that Muslims across the Middle East feel under siege. And so as a result, you say, okay, well, let's rally around that. I think the focus on family law, though, also comes out of a broader shift we have during this period, one that's in some sense very historically striking, namely that in the early to mid 20th century, we see a broad shift among Muslims to seeing Islamic law as something primarily enforced by the state. I'm not arguing that prior to colonialism, the Sharia as lived was marginal at all, but rather that it was primarily horizontal in its practice, that your social leaders, your social institutions, your local communities are in a sense enforcing the Sharia, are setting a set of normative standards. And one of the things we see with the rise of secular national states in the Middle East in the early to mid 20th century is suddenly you have these really powerful secular nationalist rulers engaging in these top-down projects of political, economic,
wait. I want to
social
come to
reform.
that. I think that's important. When Western colonizers come, that's a massive threat to your way of life, your values. They're uprooting everything. You've got this foreign rule. They're of another book. That's a very plausible story. But how can we test it empirically? Is there any data to say that before colonialism, things were more lax? So, for example, to consult the person I consider the divine authority, Michael Cook, he would talk about how, Arab travelers would go from the Islamic heartland to West Africa, Malaysia, Indian Ocean, and they would see like naked girls or queens or all kinds of, unexpected mixing. Or when Ibn Battuta went to Anatolia, he would see a woman stretching her vagina and be very surprised. Or, there were all stories in the Abbasids. There were travelers who went from Iran or Persia then, and they would go to the Byzantine Empire and see like women out on display in public, royal banquets, and they were horrified. So all I'm saying is all the evidence suggests that even before colonialism, there was still a lot of religious conservatism. And so I'm just wondering, how much extra do you get as a result of the backlash?
So I think there's actually two different stories going on here which converge on the question of Islamic law and gender, but are in some sense separate from it. One is this question of how religiously conservative should society be. The other is what is the role of state power in enforcing that conservatism. I completely agree with you that we have um, a real religious conservatism in the pre-modern Middle East, and that makes, prior to colonialism, and that makes very good sense. We have particularly extreme versions of that conservatism that we see in places like Arabia, whether we're talking about the Hanbali project, or even we're talking further south in Yemen. What I find striking about the colonial and post-colonial period isn't the turn to religious conservatism, because that already exists. It's that turn to conservatism, A, adopts state power and regulating bodies through state power as a primary mode. And secondly, that in some sense we lose a lot of the local diversity of these communities, because this is a project of state power that seeks to efface everything else. Now, the final thing I'd say here, though, is that yes, there is religious conservatism prior to colonialism. Yes, there is religious conservatism in reaction to colonialism. But what I would argue is that religious conservatism post-colonialism is not simply more focused on state power as a means of regulating rather than local social institutions. And right, that makes a lot of sense, because a lot of those social institutions have been weakened, if not destroyed. It also articulates a much more expansive vision of what it means to be socially conservative. That in any society, including pre-modern Islamic societies, you have a tremendous gray area, a lot of things that people do that are not strictly consistent with Islamic law as it is
Sure.
generally understood by the jurists, but people just do it, right? And no one talks about it too much. And no one, there isn't nearly the same concern with contradiction, and there's an acceptance of that ambiguity.
But how much of that was just because some people were doing stuff in peripheral area? One is, as you say, in the absence of state institutions, in the absence of mass schooling, you don't have that strong homogenizing power. Like, once you can get kids into school, you can get everyone to read from the same hymn sheet, right? But and also, if lots of people are living in rural areas, well, we can hardly police that village. So some of the leveraging of state power is just that previously states were weak. But I interrupted your earlier point about the secular nationalists.
Yeah.
I want to ask you a question. Why do you think so many of the early post-independence rulers, like Bourguiba, were so secular? What's your theory on that?
Well, it's an easy contrast with the Ottoman Empire. And right, there's here an underlying question that we see in the case of Islamists and secularists is, how do ways of seeing the world relate to political, economic, and social power? I mean, this is a real dilemma. And one way to discredit an idea is to say it's wrong. Another is to say it's useless. And this is for both Islamists and secular nationalists. This is essentially the position they take vis-a-vis the traditional scholarly class, the ulama, who align themselves with particular schools, the madhabs. They say, look, the problem isn't just that you're wrong. The problem is that you are absolutely incapable of dealing with any of the problems we have today. And so if you're thinking about how do you distinguish yourself in the shadow of the Ottoman Empire, then one reaction is to say, well, we need to continue to be Muslim and to be devoutly Muslim, and that will help us solve our problems. Another is to say, actually, the problem is we look at our Western colonizers and they're secular, or they appear secular to us. Whether they're actually secular is an entire. And we need to be secular ourselves because religion is holding us back here. And this is something we see as a discourse among secular nationalists. So in the same way that it's not shocking that we see the rise of secular nationalist rulers in a post-Ottoman Middle East, so too is it not shocking that in reaction to the secular nationalist rulers 40, 50 years later, we see religious revivals, right?
I think that's brilliant. That's so brilliant. I'm 100% convinced. I want to give you two examples to emphasize your brilliance. So one, I think a really good case is Tunisia. After it was relentlessly attacked by the French, they launched the secular military academy. They launched a secular university. All of this was defensive modernization. And I don't know whether you're familiar with the Jadis in Central Asia, the Uzbekistan. And this was a really interesting critique. They really satirized the mullahs. They said, the mullahs were anti-scientific, they're holding us back, and they're stalling progress. And they mocked them, they laughed at them. And so there's a really fascinating paper by economists called Successful Democracies Breed Their Own Support by Ajamoglu and others. And basically it argues that people who've lived under democracies that also have strong public goods and economic growth, they think, hey, democracy is great. But the flip side of that is if you live in a place with stalled development, stagnation and corruption and all these terrible, terrible problems, then you'll think whatever the current regime is crap. You vote out the incumbents. And if your incumbents are a bunch of mullahs, you think, oh, those people are terrible. If your incumbents are these secular modernizers like Nasser in Egypt, you think, oh, these people are terrible, right? That's such a great way.
Because people have a lot of trouble distinguishing between political policies and identities, that they often think primarily in terms of identity, pay less attention to policy. You read from Laura Beer about Nasserist secular nationalism and about these assumptions of the danger of female sexuality and of the need to regulate female bodies in public. And they're necessary for their existence in public is necessary for the success of the secular nationalist project. So therefore they must be in public, but their being in public raises risks of contaminating public space in a way that you would generally associate with Islamists or Salafis. But actually this is a secular nationalist position. And if anything, and here, I think this is where I perhaps am a little bit provocative when I'm writing about Salafism and gender segregation, that the logic of Salafism's ambition to regulate all of public space along gender lines is actually something that makes a lot more sense in terms of Egyptian secular nationalism's view of women in public space than anything else. That's its ideological cousin. And we don't generally think of state feminism and secular nationalism as linked to Salafism and gender, but you call a spade, they're in close proximity, and it makes a lot of sense.
No, I'm totally with you. I mean, in Central Asia, the Soviets' first thing was the Hujum campaign, getting women to take off their veils, right? That is a mark of new Soviet womanhood. Yes, the battle over women's bodies to sort of mark a new identity and ideology.
Yeah, and this is a battle that, if we want to understand its origins, we have to look at the secular nationalists as well, at not just left, but also right, because it's there.
I'm with you. I'm totally convinced. I love this framing. It's not just about whether it's wrong, it's about whether it's useless. That's great. Okay. Now, I have a question. Okay, now tell me, what was the Islamic revival? What was new about it?
So we're primarily talking about a social movement. And there are plenty of people who, in a time of tumult, turn to new visions. And so we have these ingredients here, right? We have the ideological and military disappointment of the 1967 war. We see religious outpourings among both Muslims and Christians. I would think about this as an opening for the articulation of a new way of understanding not only the individual citizen, but also of articulating the relationship between state and society. And in the context of that opening, you essentially have two sets of competitors. One, which is pretty common to think about, namely Islamists and Salafis. Specifically in Egypt, the Muslim Brotherhood, and Ansar Sunna al-Muhammadiyah, Egypt's oldest Salafi organization.
Can I just interrupt you for listeners?
Yeah.
Can you distinguish for our listeners Islamists and Salafists?
Yes. So Islamists seek to transform state and society along Islamic lines using contemporary organizational forms. Their goal is fundamentally ecumenical, that they are about shared goals. They're not about everyone believing, having the same theological views or the same legal views. They're trying to establish as big a Muslim tent as they can to achieve the goal of Islamizing both state and society. And if we're defining Islamists, we should note that initially the goal is Islamizing society, that the focus on an Islamic state is something that develops over the course of the 20th century.
How do Islamists see, what would an Islamized society look like for Islamists?
That's a great question. So in broad terms, it's a society where one doesn't have a variety of un-Islamic acts, quote unquote, going on. So one doesn't have gambling going on. One doesn't have the sale of alcohol. One doesn't have mixed gender spaces. The Sharia is applied. Though, to be clear, this is something that Islamists only really start talking about in the 1950s. And there's a wonderful Ijbis article by Nathan Brown from probably 25 years ago where he looks into this. But this is fundamentally a project of, we might understand this as a religious nationalist project. It's fundamentally a project of Islamizing state and society that, in conceptual terms, is very similar to secular nationalism, right? It has a different set of ideological goals, but structurally speaking, it's quite similar. It also assumes the primacy of the nation-state frame, that Islamists talk about a transnational caliphate, but as a matter of practice, they are all functioning within the nation-state, and that's their main theater.
Okay, so how is Salafists different?
So the way to think about Salafists is that they don't care primarily about politics, that they are concerned first and foremost with two things. One is correct theology, and the other is a correct approach to Islamic law. That they would rather, that if you don't follow what they understand to be the correct theological positions, namely Neo-Hanbali theological positions about God's names and attributes, and you don't derive all Islamic law from the Quran and the Sunna, for example, you draw on madhabs, then anything you build on that is useless. It's faulty. So unless you're going to build the core correctly, unless you have a core group that is that has a unanimous view on these issues, then anything that comes from this is useless. Okay.
So what do you mean by they don't care about politics?
They don't view politics as their main theater of activism. That this is, there's a phrase coined by a leading 20th century Salafi scholar, Muhammad Nasr ad-Din al-Albani, of tasfiyah wal-tarbiyah, of purification and education. That their basic goal, and they often understand themselves in the terms of the early Muslim community in Mecca, right?
Yes.
Before there's any political power, that you need to spread the call of Islam just locally, with those close to you, spreading the correct ideas before you make any attempt at achieving political power, because that's the necessary build-up to a successful project. That whereas they look at the Brotherhood and say, they're aiming for political power, but to what end? They're not ready. Society is not ready. Salafis say we need to prepare society for this. And for some, the state power will simply logically follow from social power. But ultimately, the fundamental concern isn't, they don't have a real vision of a state.
So is it a strategic question that first of all you need to get each individual to cultivate ethical character and cultivation, and then once everyone's got the appropriate practices, then you can... Do they not think that you should use the state to institutionalize and homogenize proper piety, like through madrasas or through Sharia law?
As a general matter, no. The Salafi position is in part strategic, but it's also deeply principled. They see the secular state as secular, right? They see the Egyptian state as not simply a set of institutions that can be used to your ideological goals, but as fundamentally an alien set of institutions. So this is the reason, this is sort of the perspective that leads to the vast majority of Salafis being quietists, that they don't engage. They, by and large, don't engage with the state. That their focus, by and large, is how do we develop our local institutions, mosques, educational institutions, that allow us to spread these ideas in ways that really build a proper understanding within the population. And then, in the long term, that will lead to not just an Islamic society, but also an Islamic state. But ultimately, there's no point in rushing it, right? And the reason not to rush it isn't because they have some incredible reservoir of patience that the rest of us don't have or that Islamists don't have, but because they fundamentally see it as a fool's errand to say, let me get control of the state and suddenly I can Salafise society. Now, there is a minority within Salafism who take exactly that perspective, who are very much influenced by Islamist ideas of the power of the state and then the urgency of transforming society from top down. But that's not the vast majority of Salafis, what I know well. In the post-2011 period, it doesn't mean that Salafis didn't engage with politics, right? So you have Egypt's oldest Salafi organization, Ansar Sunna, and then you have a more recent group, which was established in the late 70s, early 80s, the Salafi call, the Dawah Salafiyah from Alexandria. And the Dawah Salafiyah end up going into, and a variety of other folks end up going into parliament post-2011. But what's actually striking about that is what they're essentially doing, and Stéphane Lacroix, a fantastic scholar of Salafism, pointed this out to me at one point. He said, they're essentially pursuing the same strategy as the Sephardi Orthodox Israeli religious party Shas does, which is they don't actually want to rule the state. That's not their goal. Their goal is not even to gain control over particular ministries, but rather their goal is to get the resources they need to from the state to live as they wish to in a given country. And so they have a very, even when Salafis turn to parliamentary competition, they don't tend to have a real idea of what comes from parliament other than resources. That this is a question of how does one get the most resources one can to support a particular social project. Now, there is, of course, an outlier to these statements, namely Salafi jihadism, or jihadi Salafism, whatever people like to call it, who have very much adopted a revolutionary idea of state activism, that you topple the state, you implement Islamic law, you implement a Salafi understanding of Islam, and that is that. But they're simply the vast minority of Salafis, and that's
a really important distinction that I just want to emphasize for many of our listeners. So when you talk about Salafis, you're primarily focusing on what you call quietist Salafis, which are people who want to cultivate ethical cultivation, and that may include, regimes about how do you pray properly, what are your rituals, separating yourself from people of the opposite sex who you're not related to. That's very distinct from more violent extremism. And we're not talking about violent extremism, we're talking about quietist Salafism, right?
And not just that, but if we're talking about the Salafi jihadi strain, it's worth noting that jihadism as a movement, we can start to trace its emergence to 1970s Egypt, but it's not initially Salafi. And that actually one of the things we get, and this comes up in Thomas Hegghammer's wonderful book about the Salafi Islamist scholar Abdullah Azam, is that when Osama bin Laden gets to Afghanistan in the 80s, and he's sort of making his way through the Mujahideen camp, and bin Laden is a Salafi, and so he's trying to essentially enforce his understanding of Islam. He's trying to get people to pray as he does and as he understood the Prophet prayed and so forth. And one of the problems here is that most of the Mujahideen weren't Salafi. That's not how they approach theology, that's not how they approach law. And so there's essentially a problem that Salafis, who are a minority even within the jihadi movement in the mid-80s, face, which is they can continue to be purists on theology and law and alienate everyone else, or they can kind of shut up about it for a while and see if they can convince everyone without alienating everyone and focus on fighting the jihad against the Soviets.
May I ask you another question? What is the Wahhabist view on state power? How would you distinguish between Salafism and Wahhabis in terms of attitudes towards state?
So this is a really important point and an often confused one. So there are many people who conflate Salafism and Wahhabi Hanbalism. And the reason they conflate them is, one, the financial and ideological power of Wahhabi Hanbalism in the last few decades of the 20th century. It's also the case that Salafis and Wahhabi Hanbalis both can reasonably say that they adhere to being Salafi of creed, of theology, of Aqidah. And that this is actually a theological approach that was preserved in the Hanbali school of law. So they agree on theology.
And when we say theology, maybe it's worth saying to the listeners that the term Salafi, as I understand it, is about the pious ancestors and about emulating the first three generations who are revered within Islam as to be the most perfect, the most pious, and we've got to get back to that state. So both Salafi and Wahhabi agree on we've got to get back to those pious ancestors. Okay, so how do they disagree on attitudes towards state or dawah missionary movements?
So the really striking difference between them is that, and this is why I'm very careful to call them Wahhabi Hanbalis, even though if you ask them, they would say, well, we are those who uphold the oneness of God, is that they draw on the Hanbali school, right? They draw on precedents of the Hanbali school. If they are making an argument about whether something is permissible or forbidden, they are citing precedents from within the Hanbali school. Salafis are going to the Quran and the Sunnah. The Hanbali school does nothing for them. So right off, we have a real difference, namely that Wahhabi Hanbalis, though they have a preference in some contexts to saying, well, this comes from the Quran and the Sunnah, they are also hemmed in to some degree by rulings of the Hanbali school, and they also have certain tools at their disposal that Salafis don't have. So, for example, a pretty common tool that we can find in pre-modern Islamic jurisprudence in the madhab tradition is that of damning the pretexts of sin, of sadd al-dhariyat. This idea that there may be an action that is not explicitly forbidden, but if it obviously leads to a forbidden act, so for example, of say extramarital or premarital intercourse of zina, then it's forbidden. Okay, and they can just say, look, this is an issue of sadd al-dhariyat. This is the justification, for example, that the doyen of the Wahhabi Hanbali religious establishment, Muhammad bin Ibrahim, used when he was arguing against gender mixing. That this is clearly an issue of a set of actions leading to fornication, to zina, so therefore it's forbidden. Salafis, and he can then cite a variety of sources from within the Hanbali tradition to do that. Salafis have much more trouble there, because sadd al-dhariyat is a weak argument for them, that they want a proof text from the Quran and the Sunnah. The madhab tradition is a weak argument for them because they want a proof text from the Quran and Sunnah. That isn't to say that they will never resort to these textual justifications or tools that we see in the madhab tradition, but it's just a much less strong argument. And that's something I talk about in the book.
So wait, let's suppose you are a Saudi Salafi and you think that girls should not go to school.
I wouldn't say that Wahhabi Hanbalis or Salafis are anti-women's education full stop. I think the argument against women's education is primarily one of what is required to get that education. Now, as a practical matter, those things can obviously be pretty similar. But as an intellectual matter, the issue isn't do women have a right to education. It's do women have the right to go out of the house to get that education? The answer is there are Salafi arguments for the necessity of women's education precisely because of their vision of the woman as this key nurturer of the next generation of Muslim boys and girls, and a recognition that if women are not educated, then they are limited in their ability to play a maternal role that actually raises children who are knowledgeable about Islam. Because you can't, because you can't have a vision of women as the primary educators and nurturers and forgers of the children where the women don't know anything. So there, in some sense, you've got a challenge because you have to, and this is something Salafi scholars are really struggling with in the 70s, which is, okay, we're concerned about women being out in public, but we want them to have education because we have this patriarchal social vision in which women are domestically rooted, are raising the next generation of Muslims, and if they don't have education, well, how are they going to do that?
Absolutely. I'm totally with you. And there's a really nice research showing there's what they call a gender Kuznets curve in education. First of all, men get educated, and as men get educated, they come to value education, and they want educated wives and mothers of their children. So that leads to a lagged demand for female education. So everyone's for female education. The question is, can women do it in the home? So my follow-up question, and I jumped ahead, and I should say to the audience that your methodology is by studying Islamic print media, both in Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and also Damascus, more widely. I wanted to ask you, so you're looking at these religious debates about what kinds of things are permissible. And this made me think, it looked to me in reading this that lots of things were still up in the air, were still kind of open questions, as you say, looking for textual support. And I think one thing that surprised me is that some people said that after the 10th century, the gates of jihad were closed. But from your book, it looks like they were kind of open, for some people at least.
Well, I think it's one thing to say as a conceptual matter that the gates of ijtihad are closed, and it's another thing to say that as a practical matter, scholars stopped reasoning and stopped thinking in creative ways about how to make sense of the precedents within their madhab vis-a-vis local realities. And even that was something that was problematic, right? It's that there's an right. If you want to sort of think about it as why might it be good to say the gates of ijtihad are closed as a intellectual, religious, social matter, it's that you've decided on what your canonical texts are. And so then at the point that you've decided on that, you work within them in various degrees. And yes, there are some potential downsides to saying, well, we've already decided on our core text and our core rulings, but there are also some significant upsides in terms of A, predictability, B, community, and a consensus of the broader project in which everyone's engaged. Now, one of the things we see in the early 20th century, and it's not unique to the early 20th century because one has religious reformers in many generations, not the least of which we can think about 18th century Arabia and Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab, is that you have an ideologically varied set of Muslim reformers across not just the Middle East and South Asia, but also, as you know, the Jadidists in Central Asia, who are saying, okay, how do we make Islam relevant to the modern world? How do we respond to the challenges of modernity, political, economic, social? How do we respond to the challenges of military domination by colonial powers and so forth? And for those who, and this is where this critique of the ulama, of the madhab scholars, is not just wrong, but also useless, really comes into play because they say, well, their opponents say, we have to articulate a vision of Islam, of the Islamic tradition, that responds to the challenges of today. We know that this tradition should be responsive to the challenges of today, and therefore, let's do this. And so it's there at a time where madhabs have less influence than they've had before because essentially the traditional political and social structure is teetering, if not crumbling, that there are a variety of reformist groups who essentially say, let's bypass the madhabs. Now, and that's what unites, actually, Islamists and Salafis. They think differently in so many ways about Islamic reform, but both are arguing we need to bypass the madhab tradition, that this is a real obstacle in our path to doing what needs to be done for Muslims. So the madhab tradition is in Sunni Islam, you have four madhabs that emerge. It's a legal school, but really understood not as a brick and mortar school, but rather as a legal approach. It's a legal approach where...
What is your theory for the Islamic revival of the 1970s?
So, my theory of the Islamic revival of the 1970s is that in the 1950s and 60s, secular nationalism is ascendant. And in a lot of ways, secular nationalism is really successful. We see these powerful modernizing states. We see the expansion of mass education. We see people moving from countryside to city, and really new worlds opening up. We see the expansion of literacy, all these things in which people come to be more connected, in which people come to be more economically productive, in which people have access to a wide range of consumer goods that they never had access to before. So the world changes a lot in many good ways. But it's also a transformation that has real limitations, that not everyone benefits from it, that urbanization and modernization are not just opportunities, but also traumas, that there are many people who struggle to make sense of this changing world, who might be open to it, moving to the big, say, moving from the countryside to Cairo or Alexandria, and then find themselves kind of bereft of their the existing social institutions that kind of helped them make their way through the world when they were in the countryside. That going to the big city is exciting, but it's also terrifying, and also what happens when you're having trouble. How do you get help? And of course,
so can you specify what things you would find traumatic? Like, for example, is it just, cities, they're bewildering, noisy, stressful places. I dislike them immensely. Or that's what I do. Or is it the, economic downturn? People talk about unfulfilled aspirations in Egypt over the 1970s. Or, for example, the gender mixing, which along term.
So I think it's this question of you get to the city. You may have economic disappointment, but not just economic disappointment, not just dashed expectations, but also that your social safety net doesn't function as it might once have in the countryside. And not just a social safety net, but we think about how Egyptians or anyone else gets on, and we can think about that even in terms of places like the United States. That there are a lot of things, say, when you're raising a family, that are really, really expensive. But that if you have, say, kids' clothing, for example, kids' clothing is outrageously expensive for how quickly they grow it. They move through them. But if you have a community where people pass around kids' clothes, so it really doesn't cost anyone much of anything, so this makes your life much easier. Now, if you don't have that community, it can be really difficult. Now, of course, sometimes we see the reconstitution of communities in the big city.
Where's your evidence? What's the evidence that the religious revival was triggered by lack of community? How can we prove that point?
Well, we have work on the 60s and 70s in Egypt on the alienation of urban spaces. I mean, and this is something that comes up in Islamic magazines too, of people moving to the city and feeling themselves bereft in this new cultural and economic context.
So this is something so this is, I think I should add for the listeners, that you study. One amazing thing about these Islamic magazines is they invite readers to write in and say the things that they're struggling with, the things that their concerns, which gives you this unique insight as an Arab speaker and reader as to people's concerns at the time. So can you maybe summarize some of those concerns for us?
So there are concerns about marriage. How do you get married? How do you get enough money to get married? There are concerns about making a living. There are concerns about how to balance among one's various familial obligations when people don't live as close to each other as they used to. There are concerns about how to help your kids. All of these concerns that are totally recognizable to anyone who is thinking about the challenges of young people, or even folks in their 30s and 40s. It's a changing infrastructure. It's a changing system. Now, I want to just sort of get back to your question here, though, which is to say, this happens. These are not challenges unique to Egypt during the 50s and 60s. But this happens in Egypt, and then you have the 1967 war, where secular nationalism and all its promises feels, for many people, not all, but for many, really discredited. They say,
Yes.
we were sold a faulty bill of goods.
Yes.
This is outrageous. How can we believe in Abdel Nasser anymore? Now, there's some who continue to believe in him, but many who very much lose faith in the secular nationalist project. And so then, in that context, you have one might call it an ideological opening. You have people starting to question and say, well, what does an alternative look like? And one of the interpretations of the defeat of 1967 is that, and we see this from a leading Azhari scholar from this period, Sheikh Hassan Ma'mun, is that the problem is that Egyptians were not religious enough. The problem is that the Israelis were more religious than the Egyptians, and that's why the Israelis won. Now, this is interesting for two reasons, one of which is that Ma'mun is absolutely misreading the religiosity of Israeli society writ large, but also that this is a particular way of explaining the world that comes to be seen as pretty plausible. And Ma'mun is saying this from within one of the leading state religious institutions. And so there's this opening here. And then we have the 1973 war, which is understood by Egyptians as being this miraculous war, where Egyptian troops cross the Bar-Lev line, and angels appear, and so on and so forth. And so this is happening at exactly the same time as Islamic movements are re-emerging into society, particularly on university campuses. And so we essentially have this very slow build-up from probably 73 to 76, where Islamic movements are reconstituting themselves, where state institutions are shifting from a publishing enterprise that is primarily highbrow, which is to say dusty old journals, no nice pictures, no glossy covers, to one that appeals to a broader audience. And then from really 76 to 81, ending with Sadat's assassination in October 81, you have this really pitched battle to define the nature of Egypt's Islamic revival, to say, not simply to assert that Muslims should return to Islam, that Egypt should be defined by Islam, but what that actually means in practice. And so I would say this, right? We have the opening of the failures of the limitations of modernization. We have a particular accelerant, that is the defeat of 1967 and the religious overtones attributed to 1973. And then we have a variety of actors with very different religious visions.
Wait, isn't that reasoning a bit strange to say that the war's failure in 67 could trigger religiosity, and the war's success in 73 could also trigger religiosity? Doesn't that seem like saying that the opposite leads to the same thing?
Well, but I think the context, it's not that it necessarily leads to religiosity. It leads to religiosity specifically within the context of the discrediting of secular nationalism, right? So if you had, I would say if you had a...
Why didn't 73 work to the advantage of secular nationalism?
Because, there's one thing I left out. So we've got 1970, Anwar Sadat comes to power. Sadat is a much more outwardly pious president than Abdel Nasser ever was. He's on TV all the time. He's praying. He has the Zabiba, the prayer bump, which communicates publicly that he prays regularly, if not 5 times a day. He describes himself as the believing president. He describes his regime as fusing science and faith. So he's very much committed to
I'm with you.
this
I'm
idea.
with you. Yeah, okay. Now, great. Okay. I want to ask a question. Why, across the world, why was the Islamic revival especially popular on university campuses?
Well, I think that universities are a space in the 70s where Islamic student groups and Islamic movements are allowed to be much more active than they are elsewhere in society. So, there's a counterfactual, right, where Islamic movements aren't limited in their activism to university campuses, that they can be anywhere. That you can imagine other groups emerging as significant to, say they're allowed to do whatever they want in government offices, for example. You can imagine a scenario where a bunch of government bureaucrats say, hey, this Islamic revival is a good idea. I'm really interested in engaging in this. It happens to be the case this happens in university campuses. Now, it happens there for a couple of reasons. One is that if we're thinking about the Sadat regime's strategy here, one is that they want to be able to monitor what's going on. University campuses are relatively easy. It's a lot of new people coming together. If you want to spy on it, it's not that hard. So you have a sense of what's going on these campuses. You could also argue that some of the pressing questions of gender and gender relations that Islamic movements take up are particularly hard to ignore on university campuses because you have young men and women who are sometimes encountering each other in a sustained fashion in social space for the first time. You have a real mixing of people from the countryside, from the city, and so forth. And even to get beyond this rural-urban divide, even from smaller cities, from the Delta or southern Egypt and Cairo and Alexandria, that there's still an element of the smaller cities and the big city here. And so in that context, the question is, well, how do you navigate this, right? This is in some sense a classic social environment where you don't quite know how to navigate, that it's not really obvious how you're supposed to approach social space, that you're encountering people who have very different views of how to approach social space. Now, for some people, that's tremendously exciting and fun. For other people, and I think this is not limited to Egyptian college students in the 70s, that kind of diversity and that ambiguity is terrifying. It's really stressful because you've come from a world where things essentially make sense, where you have a framework for navigating a variety of social interactions. And here suddenly you don't. Here this is really new. And so one reaction to that is to look for a clear guide. And the claim of a variety of Islamic student activists during this period is that Islam constitutes such a clear guide. Now, it happens to be the case that it's not nearly as clear as they claim it to be. And that's part of how we understand the differences among them. But one can understand the particular appeal of an Islamic vision of piety in the context of not just the broader dislocation of modernization and urbanization, but the particular challenges posed by being on a university campus.
Yes, I'm very convinced. So is that your theory as to why fiqh jurisprudence increasingly emphasized gender? Because it was so salient for everyone?
I think that that's part of the story, but I think that the longer story is that the scholars who are writing legal texts or issuing legal opinions are responding to a broader regulation of gender by the state, a broader elevation of gender and sexuality in the context of various ideological projects, which make this question of regulating gender, not just women, but also men, they make it into a problem that needs to be solved. That there is, it's not as though suddenly in the 1970s, young men and women of a certain age become interested in each other and explore what that means, sometimes in open social settings, but often not. This is a long-standing issue. This is an issue that we see as a concern going back to the 1920s for the Brotherhood. But over the course of that kind of intervening half-century, we see a much more sustained effort to regulate bodies in a gendered fashion in public space, to define gender in a binary fashion, which is less of a concern for Islamic activists, but is very much part of our broader story of state power and the regulation of gender, and then to figure out how to resolve all of the complications that come from these new prescriptions. And I think that the jurists are essentially responding to these broader, both structural and conceptual shifts in how people are thinking about regulating gender, and saying, well, if we are going to show our relevance, and if Islam truly is relevant to society, and if we're going to form an Islamic society, well, we need to get in on this too. We need to not simply talk about what's wrong, what are the problems. This is sort of a negative view of regulation. Here are the things you shouldn't do. You shouldn't mix. We also need to articulate a positive case about here are the things you do to live a pious life in this setting that feels very different than the traditional setting in which one lived the project of Islamic piety.
Okay, I'm with you. Here's a question, though. So you talked about, people are going into these cities, they're mixing in universities, which are often crowded, they're sitting in lectures with another woman or with a man, and it's all, a bit new and a bit difficult and a bit, uncomfortable. So that they write these letters, they ask for guidance, and drawing on feet jurisprudence, the Islamic scholars say, there needs to be gender segregation, or they debate how best to show that comportment through veiling, whatever, or whether there should be a barrier.
And others argue against gender segregation,
right,
which is really interesting.
Right.
But some of them say, how do we accomplish gender segregation?
Yes, how do we accomplish it? Is it through veiling? Is it through a wall, a curtain, etc.? Right. Or a female being educated inside her home. But I also wonder, here is another aspect, is what about status? Many of the messages from the Muslim Brotherhood and others are sort of status affirming, right? They affirm men's status. A man is the provider, he is the one who is responsible. And I think that, I wonder to what extent you think that status affirming messaging and status affirming institutions were an important part of religious appeal.
So I think you're absolutely right that there's a desire for status or alternative models of status in the various projects of the Islamic revival, and that conservative or patriarchal systems provide status-affirming messages here. And I think, look, we all want status. And so it's unsurprising that folks involved in these projects do too. But part of what makes the question of women's presence in public space and relatedly gender segregation so interesting is that, like female education, it puts this project between a rock and a hard place. Because on the one hand, you want this project of status. You want this project of positioning men as protectors. But on the other hand, the economic conditions make it really hard to exist with a single income for a family. That you can't live a nice middle-class life where you can provide for your children, where you can provide, say, for your parent, where you can help your parents out with one job in the government bureaucracy. That, really you need two jobs in the government bureaucracy. And even if you had two, maybe you're still doing other things to make ends meet. And so, in some sense, this puts these socially conservative pious men in a bind, because insofar as there's a social expectation or a social ideal of women not needing to work. But the other expectation socially is that, like any man, quote unquote, you can provide for your family economically. You can't do both of those. Right? And
I definitely think that could be an issue, that men could feel emasculated by their inability to provide as they should, as stipulated in the Quran. But I should push back there a little bit, because as far as I'm aware, Egyptian female labor force participation has never really been higher than 16%. Like, the vast majority of men are sole breadwinners. Like, Egypt has one of the lowest rates of female labor force participation in the world. Maybe some women might be doing a few things from their home, but it's not like these women are working anywhere near the global average. It's not like there was a sudden massive rise in female labor force participation.
But that's actually what's interesting, because there is, and the numbers, I don't have the numbers off the top of my head right now, but one of the things we see between the 70s and the 80s is that the female labor participation in government, government offices, increases significantly.
Yes.
that this is actually, that in this sense you might think of the Islamic revival as a project that both struggles with the question of women's presence in public space, even as more and more women are entering exactly this space. And not just entering it, but entering institutions that were built for a population of a smaller size. Because, right, Egypt's population goes from 18.8 million in 1947 to, I think, 48.8 million in 1976. So we have even more men and women in public space. Now, your basic point here that we're not seeing all these women rush out of, quote unquote, rush out of the home to wage labor could still stand. But it's also the case that we have a fair bit of informal labor that's not being picked up.
But that's labour force participation that's both formal. I mean, I'm saying I totally accept that more women are entering the public sphere. They're going to universities, they get it. Okay. I think Egypt has gender parity in university enrollment now. More women are going out and about. More women did work in government, absolutely. And there's a nice paper by Assad showing that when there were neoliberal cuts to state employment, the major losses were women, and that was a major trigger of falling female labour force participation. But I also think that if you've got heightened sensitivity to seeing women in public spaces, then you should have a very strong reaction to seeing, a couple of women in an office of 100 or so. And my understanding of Egypt's labour market, just like Iran's labour market, is that female labour force participation across the Middle East, both informal, formal, is systematically very, very low, one of the lowest in the world. So I don't think it was ever the case, never like Southeast Asia or Sub-Saharan Africa or the US or Central Asia today, where it's more like, it can be over, the world average is 55%, Egypt 14% today, 16%, right? In Africa, in many parts of Africa, it can be like 70%.
So the question is essentially how to make sense of this as a status project.
Yes. So I'm saying that I don't buy the argument that men felt emasculated by their wives earning, because all the data that we have on labour markets, both formal and informal, shows that the overwhelming majority of women are not working. They are in education, but only a tiny, tiny minority. Now, men may feel emasculated in many, many ways, whether that's through the brutality of the state, being harassed, being disrespected, not being able to provide, that's emasculating. Not being able to do everything, not being able to give your family the love and care that you want through material provision, that's certainly emasculating. I just don't buy that it's because of so many women were working.
Well, I think it's important here to distinguish between what these individual men were feeling about this experience and the way in which textual elites within these magazines were seeking to articulate a project of gender relations in public. And those can be very, very different things. And one of the things you really don't see in Islamic magazines from this period is men complaining about their wives. Now, or about their wives specifically working, or about this question of, you really don't see much about this question of female labor participation. It really doesn't come up, and many things come up. Look, for example, these are not magazines that are uncomfortable with private topics, particularly because many letters are anonymous. So, for example, the question of unmarried men and masturbation comes up all the time, and how to deal with this challenge. I don't have the money to get married. I have these sexual desires. What do I do? And what's the necessary evil here so that I can avoid corrupting society as a whole?
Yes.
Because the sort of alternative to abstention or masturbation is engaging in extra or premarital sex, and this is something the scholars are very keen to avoid happening. So I think we can distinguish here between sometimes unrealistic visions of textual elites and the individual men who, I think it's worth noting, as much as they're engaging in this project of piety, they have histories as individuals too. They have desires, and priorities as individuals too that go well beyond that. And insofar as piety is a project that sometimes people burn out on, persist after these projects of piety go away.
Okay, my next question is, why do you think the Muslim Brotherhood won the elections after the Arab Spring? Is that the same story of like failed secularism?
Well, I'm not sure it's so much a story of failed. It's a story of a state that had no ideological project, or a regime that had no ideological project, and no real vision of what came next. I mean, Mubarak was widely mocked throughout his reign for having essentially no ideological substance to him. I also think we have the very specific conditions of how the Arab Spring presidential elections worked out, that the final round was between Mohammed Morsi, the Brotherhood's representative, and Ahmed Shafiq, who was previously Mubarak's prime minister. So if you were to want to bring someone who represented the status quo, the pre-revolutionary status quo, you couldn't have found someone more representative of that.
What do we want? More of the same.
Shafiq. Yeah, well, exactly. And right, there's an argument for more of the same if you're terrified of chaos. But I know of people who are extremely liberal secularists who ended up voting for Morsi, even though they absolutely couldn't stand the Brotherhood.
Yes.
But because they couldn't bring themselves to sit out, and they couldn't bring themselves to vote for Shafiq. And still, and I think this is worth always noting with the Brotherhood's electoral successes, Shafiq only lost by a few percentage points. I mean, it wasn't a landslide by any means, and it wasn't as though Morsi garnered a majority in the first round of voting. He was the strongest. He was the strongest of a divided field, and then he drew a good opponent. So, in that sense, I think that's part of the story. Partially, it's a story of the fact that insofar as there was a desire for opposition, for an alternative, the secular opponents of Morsi simply weren't mobilized in the same way. They didn't have the same institutions developed. I think there's also a sense in which the Brotherhood had a really strong ideological core, that they had folks who were with the organization come hell or high water, but they then got a bunch of other votes, obviously, because they didn't simply speak in those terms. Morsi knew how to pivot to the general election, as it were.
One thing I love about your book is that you highlight that actually the Islamic revival was not unusual, in that across the 1970s there were religious revivals all over the world, whether that's in Israel, US, Thailand, etc. What was distinctive about the Islamic revival compared to others? And further question, what was distinctive about Egypt's Islamic revival compared to Islamic revival in other Muslim countries?
I think one of the striking things about Islamic revival in Egypt is how ideologically varied it was. That if we think of the evangelical revival in the United States, that yes, you have a left-wing evangelicalism, but ultimately it kind of falls by the wayside by the mid-70s, and you then have a right-wing evangelicalism that is closely linked to the Republican Party. And we see the rise of the religious right there. It very quickly becomes a project that is defined in fairly narrow political terms. So to the point where today, when someone proclaims themselves a Christian in the United States, they are generally signaling a set of conservative politics.
Yes.
By contrast, if you pray 5 times a day in contemporary Egypt, you're not that might have once been considered a political statement, but it's not considered a political statement anymore. Or if a woman veils in contemporary Egypt, similarly, it's simply not. It's simply much broader ideologically in terms of who it involves politically than in, say, the United States. So I think that's one of the really striking things to me about Egypt's Islamic revival. When I think about the United States, when I think about the rise of the religious right in Israel in the late 60s, early 70s, the emergence of Gush Emunim, when I think about liberation theology in Latin America and its emergence when I think about, say, Pentecostalism in sub-Saharan Africa, that it is, in some sense, that these religious revivals tend to be associated more clearly with specific political factions. And in Egypt, that's not the case. Now, in relation to broader Islamic revival in the Middle East, part of what makes the Egyptian distinctiveness possible is that the state is involved in religion, but is not dominating the religious sphere. Then in Saudi Arabia, the state is dominating the
Yes,
religious
of course.
sphere.
Yes.
I mean, you have this whole set of institutions that are premised on this goal. And so you can have the Sahwa movement in 1970s and 1980s Saudi Arabia, but ultimately, and literally Sahwa means awakening, but ultimately the Wahhabi Hanbali, because they already are making a claim to be upholding Islam, are actually threatened in very deep ways by the claims of the Sahwa movement. And so in that sense, I think the Egyptian case is noteworthy because, and this is part of what makes its vision, the visions of piety that came out of it, so successful, that they're not politically charged in ways that, say, a cross in the United States or saying you're Christian is politically charged, precisely because everyone comes to do it. Because there's, and this is, you see people praying the Dhuhr prayer in late 1970s Egypt, and after that, and you see people assembling in this way today in Cairo, and the question isn't, well, are those the Islamists going to pray, or are those the Salafis going to pray? Now, of course, there are Islamists and Salafis who go to pray, but there are also plenty of other folks who don't have those ideological sympathies. So as a result, there are a variety of other things that these groups need to do to further distinguish themselves. But that's a subset within the Islamic revival in Egypt rather than the dominant overarching
May I
strain.
ask, to what extent is that just a function of Egypt's authoritarianism? Like when a state is so authoritarian that it's difficult to have so much political differentiation, perhaps the major form of free anti-incumbent expression is Islam. For example, if we look at work in, I don't know if you've read Kathleen Collins' work on Islam in Central Asia, and she talks about how many people turning to Islam, and one of the things she highlights is that they want a clean government, and they believe that Sharia is clean, and they think it's an anti-corruption, partly because one, it's got piety, but also it hasn't been tested. So it's got this sort of anti-incumbents. Yeah. Or, for example, in Malaysia, in the 2022 elections, a lot of people who voted for the Islamist party, they said, we're anti-corruption. And like they see it as like the clean alternative. And so I wondered to some extent, if you've got these very authoritarian regimes where many political parties are restricted in many, many ways, Hashim Salam has got a book arguing that anyway, so I just wonder if in authoritarian countries where they repress lots of the opposition, to what extent is the anti-income, you're allowed to express resistance through religion rather than anything else?
Well, I think that's absolutely part of the story. And I think that this is one of the real advantages of having an Islamic revival in an authoritarian country rather than having an alternative project, because you can go to the mosque on Friday and assemble for the Friday sermon, and there's nothing explicitly political about that. The sermon's contents may or may not be political, and that can be regulated to some degree, but there are many things that go on in any religious institution that are much harder to regulate. And then, and we see this in the Islamic Revolution in Iran in '79, really in the build-up to the revolution. People go to the mosque, and then word has been passed around that there's going to be a march from the mosque to some central square. It's very hard to stop that.
Yes.
You don't want to, if you're the ruler, even if you're the secular ruler, the secular dictator, you don't really want to be in the position of telling people they can't go to mosque, because there are enough people who, beyond the folks who are clearly planning to go to the march afterwards, there are enough people who aren't, and it's enough of a blunt tool that it's a way of alienating people pretty substantially. And so I think we might say that in authoritarian political settings, the plausible deniability towards politics provided by religious institutions are often a real advantage. One of the things the Egyptian state has tried to do over the last, 80 years is to try to exercise greater control over what goes on in mosques, to incorporate more of them into the government system, so they call them government mosques rather than popular mosques. This policy has basically been a failure, but several years back, I remember reading about how Sisi was trying to install CCTV cameras in all mosques so he could monitor
Oh my
the
God.
sermons. But which is, on the one hand...
Was he able to do that?
I think he installed in some, but it's a funny move, right? Because if you're going to... one thing is, can you do this? And the other is, then who's going to watch all the sermons, right? You're going to have thousands of sermons from throughout the country. And so monitoring this, and then you need to monitor it, then if there's an issue, you need to follow up on it. It's a ton of work. And so I'm skeptical of this project of regulation because it just leads to more and more challenges of, well, how do you assert... Once you know this, how do you assert state authority? It's not really a self-perpetuating system where you have what you understand to be a moderate, but what really is an apolitical religious vision that essentially kind of goes along and self-regulates. You need to be constantly regulating. So this is a challenge. And I think that those imams that are being appointed by the state and sent to places that they don't have prior social ties are generally less persuasive. Now, it's sometimes the case the state hires imams who are local to the area, who have local respect. That's a really good way. If you're trying to assert authority, that's a really smart way to do it. Because then those people actually have some credibility that goes beyond them being affiliated with the state. There's a variety of credentials that these religious leaders can have. In Egypt, a lot of the credentials come from the state educational system, the Azhari system of institutes and then studying at Azhar. It's less common, except in Salafi circles, to have someone who spent significant time in Saudi Arabia, for example. I mean, this is something you obviously see elsewhere. But in Egypt, it's less common. If anything, it's more common for Egyptians to go to Saudi Arabia, particularly when this was the case in the 70s and 80s, or even 60s, to go to Saudi Arabia to teach in the Saudi educational institutions, to sometimes serve within the Saudi religious hierarchy. That was almost more common than the opposite.
Wait, I have a question here. I have a question.
Yeah.
This is going to be my final question. Okay. In the 1970s, Saudi Arabia got rich, suddenly rich on oil. To what extent how do you think that shaped Egypt's Islamic revival? What would have been different if Saudi wasn't rich? If Saudi was just a desert, what would be different today?
So the too long didn't read version of this is not much. I think Saudi influence on Egypt's Islamic revival is vastly overstated.
Really?
Now, and the reason for that is this.
That is very juicy. Okay.
So the general narrative you get in Egypt about Salafism is that this is a Saudi import. But we know that's not true. Mm-hmm. Right? We know that Ansar Sunna is established in 26. We know it's developing over the course of the 20th century. We know that Saudi scholars come to Egypt, are often hosted by Ansar Sunna over the course of the first, this period from the 20s through the 70s, but are not dominating. And quite frankly, because the Saudis, the spigot of oil money hasn't begun flowing in a major way. I mean, right, we're not just talking about oil, but we're talking about specifically price hikes post 73. We only see the real juicing of Saudi religious institutions' transnational activities in the late 70s. And Mark Farquhar's wonderful book, Circuits of Faith, talks about this. And so Egypt's Islamic revival is already underway. The Saudis aren't providing the money. They're not really providing any significant number of scholars, that occasionally you'll see a Saudi Salafi scholar writing in to Ansar Sunnah's journal, so someone like Bin Baz or Bin Uthaymin, but for the most part not. For the most part, they're homegrown Salafi scholars who have spent most of their careers in Egypt. And so I do think there is a story of the spread of Wahhabi Hanbalism globally from the 80s on that you can say oil money plays a big role here. But I just don't see any evidence that that's the case for Egypt's Islamic revival. The timing doesn't work, and
I want to push back. I want to push back, and you can tell me why I'm wrong, and I will defer to you. Okay, what about during the 1970s when Egypt had suffered from the economic shock and unemployment was rising? A lot of Egyptians went to work in Saudi Arabia, right? We know a lot of labor migrants went there. Could that have encouraged cultural assimilation with Saudi Arabia?
So this comes up a little bit in Islamic magazines from this period, right? This question of it comes up occasionally, but still noticeably. The question of the man who's gone to Saudi Arabia, comes back, he has more conservative religious practices, he's clashing with his peers, people in his mosque, and so forth. That's absolutely something that happens, but I think the crucial point here is that basic conservatism, insofar as we're identifying conservatism with Salafism, already exists.
Yeah, I'm with you.
And so, yes, migrants from the Gulf and back, are they potentially more open to Salafism than they would have been before? Sure, that's absolutely possible. But the story we have, I think, is A, it confuses different stages of Saudi Arabia's history, but B, it's this really useful political move for those who are opposed to Salafism to say this isn't really Egyptian. This is a foreign import.
Okay.
And I have no particular dog in this fight, but that's just not what the evidence suggests.
Okay, so if I could crudely summarize it, what you're saying, if we could give someone a score out of 10 for being conservative, a typical Egyptian might be already on 8 out of 10, and you go to Saudi Arabia and you become 8.5, something like that.
Well, I would say if you are inclined to religious conservatism, you're probably already conservative. Religious conservatism is already an option in Egypt. And perhaps there are people who go to Saudi Arabia and their eyes are opened to religious conservatism of a particular strain, and they go head over heels into it. That's entirely possible. But what that doesn't do is create the option of religious conservatism. That's already there.
I'm with you. Okay, next question. Okay, here's an indirect mechanism. So as I understand it, Saudi Arabia funded and gave money to Al-Azhar. Now, Al-Azhar has been a very prestigious center of Islamic learning ever since the 10th century. So is it possible that by funding Al-Azhar, Saudi Arabia financially empowered Egyptian conservatism, which could then disseminate globally? Like Qadari was the scholar trained in Al-Azhar, who then became like a very important jurist in Europe for European Muslims. So could that funding have sort of exported Egypt? Maybe we should talk about the global export of Egyptian ideology. Put Egypt in the center of the map.
I think we absolutely should take Egypt seriously in terms of its transnational influence. And there's a postdoc at NYU Abu Dhabi, Ibrahim Gamia, whose work is doing exactly this, which is really, really fascinating.
Egypt should get more of the credit for its role in transnational learning and connectivity. I would buy thousands. I'm just reading a new book actually on Al-Azhar, and it was like in 2012, I'm going to get the number wrong, I think 30,000 students from around the world were studying at Al-Azhar.
So funny story. I was doing research for my dissertation, and I went to the Supreme Council for Islamic Affairs, which is part of Azhar. I'm trying to kind of talk my way in because they had published one of the magazines that were central to the revival in Islam, so I'm trying to talk my way in. And so the first question I get, I walk in there, I don't look like the typical Azhar student, but the guy at the front desk gives me the benefit of the doubt. He said, "Oh, no, are you a scholarship student?" And I said, "Yeah, I have a scholarship. I'm thinking of my grad stipend, but whatever." I didn't say I have a scholarship from you. I said I have a scholarship. He said, "Oh, okay, you go up there." So I walk up and I end up finding some people to chat with. But it wasn't inconceivable that a 6'2" white guy could be coming to Azhar. It was a little bit unusual, but it wasn't inconceivable at all.
So I can give you data on this. I have data on this. In 2012, there were 400 students from England and 400 students from France studying in Azhar. So you would have been one of many.
I would have fit in just fine. But yeah, I think that you have this. But there's sort of what's interesting about the Azhar Wahhabi Hanbali relationship is that they actually disagree about something really fundamental. That the Wahhabi Hanbalis have a particular view of theology, and Al-Azhar has a different one, namely, which is associated with Ash'arism, which is another pre-modern Islamic theological school. And Salafis and Wahhabi Hanbalis think that Ash'arism is the straightest way to hellfire. They really, this is a really fundamental disagreement. A Wahhabi Hanbali institution or a Salafi institution would never trust an Ash'ari scholar to teach almost anything. And this is often a source of tension between Wahhabi Hanbalis and Muslim Brothers, because the Muslim Brothers are Ash'ari too. Now, despite this, and this is what's striking, is you do have the emergence of Salafis among both Azhar faculty and students. This is something that has grown within Al-Azhar. But it's still not the dominant approach. And again, I'm very skeptical of attributing it to Saudi influence as any primary driver. As a secondary factor, absolutely. I think that's perfectly plausible. But as a primary driver, I think that these are primarily homegrown ideological
So your
developments.
primary drivers would be the religious backlash against the secular modernization plus the means to counter-mobilize through print media.
Yeah, and the fact that Egypt has a really varied ideological religious scene from a pretty early period, that being a key center for the emergence of Islamic movements means that there are a variety of options that Egyptians have about how to approach piety that, sure, they're shaped transnationally, like any. Sure, they develop over time in ways that reflect a broader set of questions that Muslims, not just in the Middle East, but also elsewhere, are struggling with. But that fundamentally there is a set of movements and institutions that are long-standing and have fairly coherent identities.
Yes. I'm very convinced. Aaron, you're a superstar. And I appreciate you very much.
Alice, it's been a pleasure.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I've taken up so much of your time, but thank you. Ooh, can you just tell people what is your next project?
My next project actually is on Islam and politics and Mandate Palestine.
Oh, wow.
That I decided to step away from Egypt and to pursue a long-standing interest in Mandate Palestine. But unlike the vast majority of the folks who study Mandate Palestine, who are often social or intellectual historians, often study colonialism, my interest is actually not just those questions, but I think they're very valuable, but also thinking about Mandate Palestine and debates over Islam and politics in the broader context of existing transnational Islamic networks. That this is a story that generally folks who study Mandate Palestine don't look transnationally in terms of Islamic reform networks and don't look at Islamic law. And my argument is that these networks, and specifically the question of Islamic law, are these key sites by which, or key questions by which, the internal divisions within the Palestinian national project are drawn, in which it's defined, in which the relationship between religious and political identity is drawn in the Mandate period.
That is fantastic. And I think the transnational element is so important because one is precisely in the 1970s that you saw this boom in transnational connectivity, also international organizations, sharing and learning. Bravo. Okay, well, I wish you the very, very best. And then when it's published, you must come back and chat again and tell me everything.
Sounds good. It was a pleasure.
Thank you.
Have a good night. All right, take care.